Hi everyone, and welcome to this, our study guide review session for your final exam in April 2015. So, over the course of the last few weeks, we've addressed a lot of different materials. My goal today is not to go through all of these questions, but to help you identify some of the areas, the trickier questions, that is, and to think through them logically. I would contend that this isn't really so much exam about memorization, although obviously, inevitably, that is part of it too. But what it is really, I think, is an exam, I think, where you're welcome to think and engage. And I'm here today to try to help you with some of the questions that might involve some sort of trickier analytics, so to speak. So without any further ado, let's get started. You, of course, know that you have to book your exam online, and you can do by the phone or via the link. We have the entire week this week to take this exam, and you'll have a generous amount of time to take the exam. So here on page 2, we have a list of chapters to be covered from the main textbook. They correspond to the chapters mentioned in the syllabus. And we also have a number of documentaries which we've watched in class, including Citizen 4, Michelle Alexander. Well, it wasn't a documentary, I suppose it was more of an interview, and then the Occupy Wall Street documentary that we looked at. The way I would suggest going through these materials is not to reread everything, not to rewatch everything exhaustively. I would say that that's probably a recipe for disaster. The purpose in providing the study guide is to guide your studies so that you don't have to go back and revise everything. What I'm guiding you in on are some of the key aspects, the key lessons, things that we need to be sure that we've learned after a semester like the one we've had. So we had learning objectives, and these questions assess approximately our ability to grapple with these learning objectives. So let's sort of start here with some questions like how are mass movements different from interest groups? Well, the question here is going to be one that is somewhat logical in some ways. Mass movements, obviously, when we discuss the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, were not so much in asking for anything from government. They were interested in articulating a demand, if you will. They had the one demand, so to speak, that they had was much more to do with how wider society was going to react to them and see them. So it wasn't a demand expressed vertically, it was a demand expressed horizontally, and that's the key thing there. Whereas if you contrast that last semester to what we were talking about as interest groups, they very much have a sort of a inside the beltway perspective. A lot of them are going to be addressing their demands, so to speak, their pressure group techniques, their interest group techniques, to specific types of people that we find within the Washington, D.C. Beltway, occasionally reaching out. The so-called fake AstroTurf movement was discussed with the Tea Party. We discussed a little bit about that in class, and we weren't sure at the end of the day how much of the Tea Party was real grassroots or AstroTurf. But that's the terrain that this question's operating on. Moving along, we have some other questions which are useful to think about. What attitude do those engaging in civil disobedience share about breaking the law? We covered that in the lecture, we covered that in class, but one of the ideas would be maybe perhaps that without having a somewhat flexible attitude towards breaking the law, you're not going to get the media coverage you need, but also that sometimes the law itself can be incorrect, right? So there's a sense of moral purpose. There's a sense of also the fact that breaking the law is a necessary part sometimes, or at least going to the edge of breaking the law is a necessary part sometimes of achieving the goal of mass movement mobilization, which is to generate media attention at the end of the day. So moving along here, we have, I've just highlighted some of the questions here that we can look at as we go along. Um, One of the questions here is, what is the theory of relative deprivation? I think that's an interesting question. I think one of the things we were arguing was that, oddly or ironically or paradoxically, it's not on the way down that people protest, right? It's not as the economy is getting worse. Oddly, it is often as the economy is starting to get better that people feel the need to express their anger at what's going on around them. When people take to the streets, and more commonly, it's because they're starting to see a lift in the economy, but they're seeing that where everyone had to tighten their belt on the way down, now that the sacrifices have been made, some sectors of the society are clearly recovering quicker, recovering better, and that is maybe because they have greater favor with elites, or that they are part of certain sectors that are privileged by the government. So it is then at the time when the economies were starting to recover that you start to see the most likelihood of social protest. Question 7 here is an interesting one. In the era of party decline, candidates for Congress. Well, if you remember from our Congress lecture, one of the things we were arguing was that, prior to, say, at least the Newt Gingrich moment in the middle of the Bill Clinton era, that we had maybe a more individualistic Congress, and the parties were not as strong. What Gingrich did was to refocus attention on the party and to really sort of create a party power structure. And that's something that's really stayed with Congress to this day. So moving on from there, another question comes up is the question of what is an iron triangle. And if you remember in class, that was a really interesting dynamic that we were identifying, wherein we talked about how lobbyists, specifically interest groups, have sort of a reciprocal relationship with the other branches with the branches of government, principally Congress and the executive bureaucracy. Now, it's not always obvious what that relationship might be, so it's worth talking about. Congress, of course, we would understand that part of it pretty well, because that's an easily I scratch your back, you scratch my back kind of proposition. That's in fact what was complained about by the judge in Citizens United, if you remember, right? That you were going to have these groups out there spending a lot of money in a non-affiliated way to support a certain candidate, and then of course, what's the expectation legislatively on the other side of that, right? So is Citizens United bad for us in that respect? Well, I think it's clear what the judge was arguing, but an iron triangle goes a little bit further than that, because it's not just an I scratch your back, you scratch mine relationship between Congress and the legislative groups or the interest groups. In fact, there's also a relationship between Congress and the bureaucracy in terms of how the bureaucracy wants often to be seen to be working with Congress. These are the so-called permanent government. They get funds from Congress. They want to mark their territory. They want to expand their domain of operations because of just rational interests. That's how they get better institutional support for what they're doing. So the civil service, the bureaucracy, has an interest in working with Congress. But then also there's this relationship between the bureaucracy and then the lobbyists as well, insofar as the lobbyists will also often go straight to the bureaucrats to help in framing and understanding the process of legislation and the kind of language that needs to be used in legislation. So the interest groups can also guarantee to the bureaucrats a certain amount of congressional support. So it's a two-way flow there as well. So you have at each end of the triangle a two-way flow of I scratch your back, you scratch mine, and that is in effect then this sort of dense triangle that emerges, an iron triangle, that would, from the perspective of popular democratic theorists, be something to worry about, because it suggests that if you're not part of that process, then you're not really getting an influence on how legislation is made and how it is argued for and how it is implemented. So that is important to recognize. Now, we mentioned, of course, in the 1980s and the idea of an increasing party unity. This is sort of a lead up to the so-called congressional revolt of Newt Gingrich in the 90s. During the Clinton administration, we start to see an increasing amount of party unity in Congress, and it changes things for the way, for the autonomy of individual congressmen, both in terms of who's running for Congress. These are no longer going to be self-funded congressmen. They are going to be increasingly part of a party apparatchik. They're going to be part of a sort of a top-down run and maintained party system, which contrasts dramatically to the type of system that had prevailed in the previous decades. Moving on, another question that might be logically difficult or tempting at least to talk about is the context of the modern presidency. Has the cabinet gained or lost power in relation to the White House staff? But one of the things that's really been going on here is the fact that the president has a certain amount of power constrained by the Senate in terms of his immediate cabinet. He may therefore, because people he appoints as formal cabinet ministers, formal cabinet secretaries, can be summoned or called before Congress. He has increasingly opted to put together a cabinet, a sort of a secondary cabinet made of irregular advisors, which are part of his staff, and they cannot be sanctioned the same way that his actual staff, his actual ministerial cabinet can be sanctioned. Now, one of the things we have to address, having said that, is what the upshot of this is for the president's ability to be sort of connected to the real world. And once you've taken on staff members as your principal advisors, and you're listening to them more than you're listening to your cabinet, you have the risk that you are basically dealing with people who are telling you what you want to hear. And so like-minded people hired to tell you you're doing a great job, are not necessarily going to be as forceful with you or object to your ideas as people who are accountable to other branches of government for what they're doing. So the cabinet members have a motivation to obviously behave themselves, to see themselves as accountable not just to the president but to the nation, whereas these private advisors are only on the president's staff, and therefore they don't feel that same accountability, it is argued. Now, 17 is a bit of a typo here, but in what way might we say FDR used elite democratic methods towards popular democratic ends? Well, I can't give you the answer to this question, but one of the important sort of aspects that we are addressing here is the fact that FDR, as is discussed in your textbook, was interested in a New Deal, and he was, for example, vis-a-vis the Supreme Court, threatening to load the Supreme Court if the Supreme Court didn't help him exactly. So that's not the answer to the question, but it's an example of one of the types of ways that we can think about that question, that building on a popular democratic mandate, FDR used the apparatus of the state in a manner that's sort of counterintuitive in the respect of how we've been talking about popular democratic aspirations to maintain and manage democracy. FDR was kind of an unusual proposition in that regards. We had a long debate in class about constitutional textualism. Should the Constitution be read as a document that speaks to us in our own time, or should we be going back in time to try to understand the debates, the controversies of the founding fathers and the people who were alive in and around the time of the Constitution being written? Question 22, Dred Scott versus Sanford. I think this is, of course, a sad case in the history of the US Supreme Court. It's a case that many people say led to the Civil War, but it is also the case where we understand that a man who was a slave could not, simply because he was in a free holding, an anti-slavery state, he could not just automatically become a free man. The rule of 4 is a Supreme Court. We're transitioning here into our module about the Supreme Court. So the rule of 4 pertains to how certain cases end up being heard before the Supreme Court. Barron versus Baltimore. Well, this is a case that was instrumental in the time of John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, in suggesting that the Bill of Rights, which, as you know, is a constitutional amendment that was introduced after the original Constitution was passed. The question was whether this would apply as a requirement for state governments in their affairs and their dealings with their citizens. And while it was a case that didn't really relate to civil rights, it later had impact for civil rights because it specifically was interpreted as saying that the federal government could not use the Bill of Rights as a basis for requiring states to abolish slavery. And so it's a crucial case in that respect. Now, the question of how then the Supreme Court evolves and orients itself to the question of civil rights starts to become more powerfully expressed after the Civil War. And as you know, we have Civil War amendments, and they were indeed major accomplishments. But it's not for some time before we see and understand that the Supreme Court is going to try to do something about the rather lackluster performance in the years after the war. So we have to, what we were doing in our lecture in class, we were trying to set up the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution in relationship specifically to matters of commercial importance. And so Stone's footnote 4 of the U.S. v. Caroline Products Company case is very important here, because it's the case where an argument is made that the when it comes to commercial affairs, that the radical sort of individualism of an employer's ability to to order his workers around, to treat his workers a certain way, was actually something that the federal government could have something to say about. So in a way, then, it is a radical transformation for the new era of, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and people like this coming along, who are now going to be able to envision a judicial pathway to arguing that federal government has the ability to exercise a certain authority over the states in terms of how they're carrying out their commerce, but within that, for also saying that and this is what we argue, this is what the footnote is kind of relevant for as well, is because he was saying that possibly this could be the case also for civil rights as well. That the Bill of Rights, which had previously not been part of the federal government's remit in terms of its control over the state, could now possibly, via this commercial clause, be deemed to be part of the federal government's power. So it's a truly important and significant case in that respect. So we didn't do a whole lot in this class about civil liberties, and I said that was because we were going to leave some of the big issues till the end, and we did, of course, do that. We touched on a couple of questions. We had brief mention of Roe versus Wade and things like that. But some of that is going to be coming. Some of these questions are going to be questions that you're getting most of your information from the textbook on. But Roe versus Wade, of course, was very much based on the question of, what does it mean to say that a woman seeking an abortion is going to be, controlled or restricted. The reality is that we would be, in a way, drawing a difference between the bodily sovereignty of a woman and the bodily sovereignty of a man. Does government have the ability to get under your skin, so to speak? Does the authority of the government stop at your person, or can it also go into your person? And if so, what's the basis of a distinction between a man and a woman in that respect? A man who could not get pregnant would not be subject to that kind of difference of power, whereas a woman would be. So there is this question there. Moving on, we have the question of Plessy versus Ferguson, and we also have Brown versus Board of Education, and we also have Michelle Alexander. And so these are part of our civil rights questions and themes that we raised during the semester. Plessy versus Ferguson, of course. Let me see if I can figure out a way to describe that without giving the game away, but I think it's a famous case, so you probably know the answer. It's the case that decided that there could be such thing as separate but equal. Later, of course, this is repealed with Brown versus Board of Education. And then the question of Michelle Alexander, which is how are these old Jim Crow laws starting in some ways to reappear in sort of indirect ways, because of the way, for example, drug laws or drug sentencing is being enforced, and also because of the difficulty that people have in finding a stable life after they've been in prison for systemic reasons. So new Jim Crow laws are largely to do with sort of structural violence that people are experiencing, and that they are excuse me, that these sort of offenses against people are being metered out in ways that seem to affect some races way more than others. So, moving on then, we had our economics module. We talked about Keynesian economics, we talked about neoliberalism, the Keynesian side of things, or so-called demand-side economics, were very much to do with taxing and spending, whereas that produced decades of peace and prosperity. Those kinds of economics produced peace and prosperity after World War II. The economy was in debt after the Vietnam War, and so it was also importing inflation through the high cost of oil after the 1970s. And so the only way the country could really maintain its competitivity was through bringing down the one variable in the factors of production that it had control over, and that was the price of labor. So the Laffer curve then was this idea that you could bring down the price of labor. You could also increase the profitability of businesses through a tax regime that would be favorable to businesses. So Laffer was all about trying to find the appropriate trade-off between taxing a business and government revenue. Now it's since then been contested by economists quite a bit, but at the time for Ronald Reagan it was a very important bit of ideology for reducing taxes on businesses. Now, what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy, I suppose, is related to Keynesian economics in some ways, because again, it's another way of sort of saying the same thing, that fiscal policy is to do with taxing and spending in the economy, as opposed to monetary policy, which is much more to do with interest rates being set by the central bank of the Federal Reserve. What does it mean to say that America is a two-tier welfare system, two-tier welfare state? It means that those with power are going to be able to extract more privileges from the system than those without, which means effectively that the poorer you are, the harder time you're going to have. As a presidential candidate, what was Bill Clinton's stated attitude on welfare reform? I'm not going to give you the answer to this question. But the attitude was, I suppose, counterintuitive to what you might think a Democrat might stand for. And this was our point that day when we talked about it, that that Democrats aren't necessarily always as pro welfare as they are made out to be. Okay, Bill Clinton probably did more to damage or deregulate certainly did more to deregulate the economy, but he probably did more to damage and degrade the welfare system than any other president. Moving on to foreign policy then, what was the central ideological principle of George Bush's national security doctrine? Excuse me. I think, well, one of the things we've been discussing here was the idea of a neoconservative ideology, which was to do largely with the idea, in distinction to typical conservative thought processes, which are much more bound up with the idea of unintended consequences and trying to avoid over-regulating the economy, for example. Neoconservatism had a fairly adventurous attitude in contrast, and so neoconservatism really did in the United States advocate an interventionism, and specifically a kind of a preemptive warfare type policy, that America would sort of look 10, 15 years out at potential threats and act now to prevent those threats emerging. NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I think the answer for this one might be fairly straightforward. But of course, just situate yourself at the time of the creation of NATO, and it was the Cold War. So it was an alliance with European countries to maintain security during the Cold War. In the original democratic debate over foreign policy, what issues did elites and popular Democrats disagree on? Well, of course, you have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, naturally, some of them at least anyway, preferring to have a strong army that had a robust posture about overseas engagements, and that was going to try to give the Europeans a run for their money in terms of hemispheric domination and basically expanding into an empire. The George Washingtons of this world did not want that. The Thomas Jeffersons did not want that. They preferred to have a country without a standing army. And then last but not least, Edward Snowden we watched the documentary, and this is the question, I suppose. If you've not committed crimes, you've nothing to hide. Is it true from Snowden's perspective? It's not a safe bet, right? Because part of the secret of success in a democracy is to be able to ask questions, to be able to have conversations. And if we are under surveillance, we might be frightened away from having those conversations. So there you go, folks. That's just a quick tour through some of the questions of your study guide. I hope this is helpful for you. Basically, the questions, a lot of them will look similar to the ones we've just looked at. Some of them might be a bit different, but we've covered a lot of our objectives here today, and thank you for your time, and good luck with the test.